In the merciless waters of the North Sea, where ancient legends still whisper through the mist, the longship Vígríðr disappeared without a trace. All hands were lost to the depths, all except one, Björn the Bold, once the proudest warrior of his clan, was found drifting alone in a waterlogged skiff, his mind seemingly shattered by whatever horrors he witnessed in those dark waters. Now he speaks only in forgotten tongues, chanting eldritch verses that make even the oldest skalds tremble. As whale-sized shadows glide beneath the waves and ghostly howls echo through the fog, the jarl must gather his bravest warriors for one last voyage. But time is running short, and the tide of Ragnarök rises with each passing night. What ancient pact was broken beneath those moonless waters, and can the souls of the lost crew be saved before the world serpent claims them all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to Ragnarök like a burial shroud, thick enough to blur the line between sea and sky. Through this grey veil, the fishermen's boats appeared as dark ghosts, their dragon heads cutting through mist that coiled around their prows like living things. It was Erika Netsmender who first spotted the skiff, its wooden hull barely breaking the surface, drifting listlessly between the larger vessels. "There's someone in it," he called, voice carrying across still waters. By Odin's eye, it's Björn. The warrior lay sprawled in the waterlogged bottom, his once proud frame curled like a child's, salt-crusted lips moving in ceaseless whispers. His fingers traced patterns in the air, following invisible runes that only he could see. When they pulled him aboard, his skin was as cold as the deep, yet his brow burned with an unnatural fever. In the great hall of Ragnarök, Jarl Sigurd stood before the ancient horn, mounted above his high seat. 3 spans long and carved from a narwhal's tusk, the horn had hung there since his grandfather's grandfather's time. Its surface was etched with warnings of the deep, tales of creatures that dwelled in the darkness beneath the waves. For generations, it had served as both trophy and toxin. When danger threatened from the sea, its call could reach every corner of the fjord. Now, as the fisherman's tale reached his ears, Sigurd's weathered hand reached for the horn's smooth curve. "Bring him here," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 30 winters as jarl, "and send for Astrid." They brought Björn before the hall, still muttering his strange litany. The warrior's eyes were open but saw nothing, or perhaps saw too much. His fingers never ceased their movement, sketching shapes that made the air itself seem to shiver. "Where is the Vígríðr?" Sigurd demanded. "Where is my son's ship?" At the mention of the vessel, Björn's head snapped up, his eyes focused for the first time, but what blazed in them was not recognition. It was terror, pure and primal as a drowning man's last breath. "They sing," he whispered, his voice rough as wave-worn stone. "They sing in the deep places, where the old ones sleep, where the bones of the world snake coils in darkness eternal." His words shifted then, becoming something older, something that made the flames in the hearth sputter and dim. The elders, gathered in the hall, drew back, making signs against evil. Even Sigurd, who had faced down berserkers and storm giants in his youth, felt his skin crawl at the sound. Those were no words meant for human tongues. From the shadows stepped Astrid, the Völva's staff clicking against the stone floor. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharp with sight beyond sight, fixed on Björn. "Be still," she commanded, and something in her voice made the warrior's chanting falter. She approached him slowly, her free hand reaching out to touch his brow. The moment her fingers made contact, she recoiled as if struck. "This is no madness," she declared, her voice trembling. "This is a marking, a warning written in the language of the deep." Sigurd's hand tightened on the ancient horn. "A warning." "Of what?" "Of what comes," Björn answered, his voice suddenly clear. "Of what rises, of what was bound and now breaks free." His eyes rolled back, showing only whites. "The pact is broken, the tide turns, and they're coming, they're coming, they're coming." With those words, the great horn began to vibrate. humming with a note too low to hear, but felt in the marrow of every bone. And in the harbour below, the waters grew dark with shadows that had nothing to do with the morning fog. In the healing, house torch flames cast dancing shadows across Björn's arms, illuminating the mass of self-carved runes that twisted from wrist to shoulder. They were crude things, cut with what must have been a belt knife, yet they held a terrible precision. Some were familiar, protection sigils and water-crossing marks that every warrior knew, but others seemed to writhe beneath the skin like living things, patterns that made the eye slip sideways rather than follow their curves. "Hold him!" Astrid commanded as she pressed a cloth steeped in witch hazel to the wounds. The runes had begun weeping a clear fluid that smelled of brine, though Björn had been pulled from the sea 3 days past. 2 of Sigurd's strongest skalds gripped Björn's shoulders, but the warrior didn't struggle. His eyes remained fixed on something distant, something that drew whimpers from his throat when his endless chanting fell silent. "The marks," Astrid murmured, tracing one particularly complex sigil with a gnarled finger. "They're not just runes of our knowing. See how this one bleeds into the next? He's written in the tongue of the deep ones, though how he learned such things." She shook her head, silver hair catching the torchlight. Sigurd stood in the doorway, his frame filling it like a storm cloud on the horizon. "Can you read them?" "Not all. Not yet." Astrid's eyes narrowed as she studied a spiral pattern that seemed to pulse with Björn's heartbeat. "But this one speaks of binding. And this," she pointed to a jagged series of lines that resembled a serpent's scales, "this is older than any marking I've seen in 60 winters of sadecraft." As if in response to her touch, Björn's voice rose in pitch, taking on the keening note of a funeral dirge. "The chains grow thin," he sang in that strange mixture of Norse and something far older. "The sleeper stirs. What was bound in blood must be bound again, or all will drown in the tide of ending." Björn, Sigurd, stepped forward, his voice carrying the command that had led men into 100 battles. "Where is my son? Where is Eirik and the Vígríðr?" For a moment clarity seemed to flash in Björn's eyes. His hand shot out, fingers grasping Sigurd's forearm with surprising strength. "They swim," he whispered, voice raw with horror. "They swim in the dark places, where the light has never reached, where the Great One's children hunt and feed and grow. But they're not dead, Jarl. Not yet. That would be a mercy." A tremor ran through his body then, and fresh blood welled from the deepest of the runes. "We found the serpent shrine," he continued, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Deep beneath the waves, where the ancient ones built their altars. Eirik, he took the harpoon, the sacred harpoon that held the pact. He didn't know. We didn't." "And no, what pact?" Astrid demanded, but Björn's moment of lucidity was already fading. His eyes grew distant once more, and his chanting resumed, a sound like waves crushing bones against rocky shores. Outside, a cold wind swept through Ravenfjord, carrying with it the smell of rot and ancient things best left undisturbed. In the harbour, the waters began to churn, though no storm clouds darkened the sky, and deep beneath the surface, something vast and hungry stirred from its age-long slumber. Astrid's fingers trembled as they traced the final rune on Björn's arm, a symbol that seemed to drink in the torchlight rather than reflect it. "The markings," she said softly, "they're not just a warning, they're a key. He's trying to tell us how to save them." She looked up at Sigurd, her ancient eyes filled with a fear that made the Jarl's blood run cold. "But we must hurry. With each passing tide, the barrier between our world and theirs grows thinner, and when it breaks—" She didn't need to finish. They all knew the old stories, the tales of Ragnarök, and the role the world serpent would play in the ending of all things. But perhaps those stories had been warnings rather than prophecies, warnings of what would happen if certain boundaries were crossed, certain pacts broken. In the healing house, Björn's chanting took on a rhythm like waves beating against a shore, like a heart struggling to keep beating in the crushing depths. And in his delirium, he began to draw new runes in the air, patterns of light that hung for a moment before fading, leaving behind the scent of salt and secrets best left undisturbed. Astrid's chambers lay beneath the oldest part of Ragnarök's great hall, where the foundations met living rock, here where moisture seeped through ancient stone and the air tasted of earth and time, she kept her most precious possessions. By smoky lamplight, her trembling hands now traced the water-stained pages of a book so old its leather binding had gone green with age. The Codex of Tides had come to her from her predecessor, who had received it from hers, stretching back to the time when the first Vula had learned to read the secrets in the sea's dark heart. Its pages, made from cured whale skin, were covered in script that seemed to shift like sunlight through water, Norse runes flowing into pictographs that predated the coming of the Aesir themselves. Here, she said, her finger stopping on a page that depicted a great serpentine form coiled around a stone altar. It was not always serpents that ruled the deep places. Sigurd leaned closer, his battle-scarred hands gripping the table's edge. In the flickering light, the ink seemed to move, the creature's coils writhing across the page. What am I looking at? Völva? A history older than our oldest songs. Astrid's voice took on the rhythmic cadence of a teaching tale. Before the gods came, before men learned to write their stories in stone and wood, there were others who built their temples. In the deep places of the world, they made pacts with the children of the world serpent, binding them with sacred weapons and blood oaths. She turned the page, revealing drawings of spears and harpoons marked with symbols similar to those carved into Björn's flesh. These weapons weren't meant for killing. They were anchors, physical manifestations of the boundaries between their world and ours. From the healing house above came another of Björn's wails, this one carrying words that made the lamp flames gutter. Sigurd's hand instinctively went to his sword hilt. And my son took one of these anchors, the harpoon from the serpent shrine. Astrid nodded grimly. Each shrine had its guardian, a child of Jörmungandr tasked with maintaining the boundary. When your son removed the weapon, he broke the pact, Sigurd finished, understanding darkening his features like a storm cloud. And now these things hunt my people. Astrid turned more pages, her movements urgent now. Not just hunt. Listen to what Björn says. Truly listen. They swim, he tells us. The crew isn't dead. They're taken, claimed by the Deep Ones as compensation for the broken pact. A new sound echoed through the chamber then, a low, resonant note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The jarl's horn, hanging in the great hall above, was vibrating again, though no human hand had touched it. The barriers weaken, Astrid whispered, her fingers moving faster through the Codex's pages. With each passing tide, the ancient boundaries fray further. If we don't restore the pact— She stopped suddenly, her breath catching. The page before them showed a scene of devastation. Waves larger than mountains, creatures rising from the depths to drag entire villages into the sea, and at the center, a serpentine form so vast it dwarfed the chaos around it. Ragnarök, Sigurd breathed. No. Astrid's voice was sharp as a blade. Something worse. The prophecies speak of Ragnarök as a future doom, a fate woven by the Norns themselves. This, she gestured to the writhing images, this is older. A memory, a warning of what happened before, when the barriers failed completely. From above came the sound of running feet, and a warrior burst into the chamber, his face pale. Jarl, the harbour, you must come see. They followed him up through the winding passages, emerging into a night lit by a sickly green glow. The waters of Ragnarök had begun to phosphoresce, casting ghostly light on the hull of every ship. And in that unnatural illumination, massive shadows moved beneath the surface, their shapes defying any natural creature's form. Björn's voice rang out from the healing house, suddenly clear as a bell. The chains thin, the sleeper wakes. What was bound in blood must be bound again. Astrid clutched the codex to her chest, her ancient eyes reflecting the otherworldly light from the harbour. We must go after them, she said. Before the moon is full again, we must find the shrine. Recover the harpoon. and restore the binding. If we don't... She didn't need to finish. They could all see it in the waters below, the beginning of a doom so ancient it predated the gods themselves. And somewhere out there, in the lightless depths where no human was meant to tread, Eric and his crew still lived, caught between two worlds as the barriers between them crumbled. Dawn painted Ravenfjord's waters in shades of iron and blood. The green phosphorescence had faded with the night, but none who had witnessed it could forget the shapes they'd seen moving in those depths. As Sigurd's chosen warriors gathered on the shore, each carried tokens of protection alongside their weapons, Thor's hammers and rune-carved stones that had warded off evil for generations. But it was the object in Astrid's hands that drew every eye. She had found it clutched in Björn's palm when they first brought him in, hidden beneath his fingers like a secret he couldn't bear to share. A scale, larger than a warrior's shield. Its surface the color of deep water and old bones. In the growing light, its edges seemed to blur, as if it couldn't quite decide where it ended and the air began. From one of the serpent children, Astrid explained, her voice heavy with the weight of forbidden knowledge. See how it drinks the light? This is no natural thing. It remembers the darkness it was born in. Sigurd reached out to touch it, then stopped as the scale seemed to ripple beneath his approaching fingers. Will it lead us to them? Better. Astrid lifted the scale higher, letting the dawn light play across its surface. It will help us survive the journey. The deep ones cannot attack their own, not directly. With this, we might pass through their waters unnoticed, for a time. Around them, the chosen crew worked with grim efficiency. Hakon's strongarm checked the oars, ensuring each was reinforced with bands of silver-mixed iron. Ingvild Stormeye, who had sailed with Eirik since both were children, secured rune-carved chests containing sacred herbs and weapons blessed by 3 generations of Volur. And at the bow, old Thorvald One Hand prepared the offering bowl, its copper surface etched with prayers to gods older than the Aesir. 13 warriors, Sigurd counted, his voice carrying across the beach. 13 to match the crew we lost. It seems fitting. 12, Astrid corrected, her clouded eyes fixed on something distant. I must be the 13th. The old ways demand it, a Velva to speak to the deep ones, should we find them in a mood to listen. From the healing house came Björn's voice, stronger now than it had been since they found him. The paths between worlds grow thin. The bones of the deep remember what they once were. Take the scale, take the songs, but beware the darkness that never ends. Several warriors made warding signs, but Astrid nodded, as if the ravings made perfect sense. He speaks truth, though his mind is lost in the spaces between. We must take his warnings with us, written in blood and skin. She held up a piece of scraped vellum covered in copied runes, the same marks that covered Björn's arms, rendered now in careful detail. The ship they had chosen was the Wolf's Wake, sister ship to the lost Vígríðr, as they loaded the last of the supplies, salt-cured meat that had been blessed 3 times, water barrels lined with silver, torches treated with oils that would burn even in the deepest dark. Sigurd stood at the stern, his hand resting on the tiller. We sail with the turning tide, he announced, his voice carrying the authority that had led men through 3 decades of raids and ventures. The signs are clear. We have until the full moon rises to find the shrine and restore what was broken. After that, he didn't need to finish. They had all seen the images in the codex, all felt the wrongness in the air growing stronger with each passing day. The very waves seemed to whisper now, with voices that had no business existing in a world of men. Astrid took her place near the bow, the great scale secured before her in a cradle of rowan wood and silver chains. As the crew made their final preparations, she began to chant. Not the usual prayers to Aegir or Ran, but something older, something that made the surface of the scale ripple like disturbed water. And deep beneath the waves, something answered, a sound more felt than heard, a vibration that ran through the hull and into their bones. The tide was turning, drawing them out toward the deep waters where the lost shrine waited, where Eirik And his crew still lived, if Björn's ravings could be believed. As they pushed off from the shore, the morning sun caught the scale's surface, sending ribbons of impossible colors dancing across the waves. For a moment, the water around the ship grew black as night, then cleared again, as if nothing had happened. The journey had begun, leading them toward waters where no mortal was meant to sail, and truths no human mind was meant to comprehend. The day's last light bled from the sky, like a mortal wound, leaving them alone with the stars and the sea. Vígríðr Stormeye stood at the prow, her scarred hands cradling the navigator's lodestone, a piece of magnetic iron that had guided Norse ships for generations. But tonight, something was wrong. The stone spun and jerked in its copper bowl, pointing not north but down, as if drawn by something in the lightless depths below. "It's never done this," Vígríðr muttered, her one good eye narrowed in concern. "Not in 20 years of sailing these waters." Astrid looked up from where she sat cross-legged behind the serpent scale, her white hair ghostly in the starlight. "The old ways of finding path are failing. The boundaries blur, and what was below now calls to what is above." As if to confirm her words, the sea around them changed. The normal phosphorescence of disturbed water transformed into something else, patches of darkness deeper than the night itself, moving against the current. The crew grew quiet, their hands tightening on weapons that suddenly seemed inadequate against what they faced. "Hold steady," Sigurd commanded from the stern, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "Remember Björn's words. Remember why we—" The ship lurched, struck from below by something massive. The lodestone leaped from its bowl, and only Vígríðr's quick reflexes saved it from being lost to the sea. As she caught it, she cried out. The stone was cold, colder than ice, colder than death itself. "Form the circle!" Astrid's command cracked like thunder. "As we practiced, now!" The warriors moved with disciplined precision, taking positions around the ship's rail. Each held a length of silver chain, blessed by Astrid herself. As they raised the chains, linking them between posts, a barrier of sorts emerged, not physical, but something that made the air shimmer like heat waves over summer rocks. Below, the darkness gathered, coalescing into shapes that strained the mind's ability to comprehend them. Forms that suggested serpents, yet moved in ways no serpent should, bending at impossible angles, their scales reflecting colors that had no names in any human tongue. The lodestone in Vígríðr's hands began to pulse with a sickly light, its surface crawling with patterns that matched the runes carved into Björn's flesh. And then they heard it, a sound that was not a sound, a vibration that bypassed their ears and spoke directly to the primitive parts of their brains that remembered when humans were prey. "They test us," Astrid said, her hands moving in patterns above the serpent's scale. "They remember their brother's flesh." She gestured to the scale before her. "They wonder why we dare to carry it in their waters." Another impact rocked the ship, this one accompanied by a screech that made several warriors drop to their knees, blood trickling from their ears. The silver chains hummed, their links glowing with a pale fire that pushed back the encroaching darkness. "Look!" Hakon's strong arm pointed to the lodestone, his voice tight with fear and wonder. The stone had begun to move with purpose now, spinning in Vígríðr's palms before pointing firmly in a direction that seemed to exist somewhere, between north and the bottom of the sea. "It shows the way," Astrid breathed. "Not to true north, but to the shrine. The deep ones remember its purpose, even if they no longer honor the old boundaries." The darkness pressed closer, testing the barrier of silver chains. Faces formed. In the water, things that might have once been human, watching them with eyes that glowed like funeral pyres. The crew held their positions, though every instinct screamed at them to flee. "Hold fast," Sigurd called, his voice steady despite the horror surrounding them. "Remember what we saw in the Codex. Remember what awaits if we fail." The attack, when it came, was not physical. Instead, voices filled their minds, whispers in languages that no human throat could produce, promising secrets of the deep, promising power, promising reunion with lost loved ones if they would just lower the chains just for a moment. But they held. They held until the dark shapes withdrew, until the unnatural phosphorescence faded, until the sea became merely the sea again. Only then did they notice that the lodestone had grown warm once more, though it continued to point toward whatever destination called to it from the deep. "The first test," Astrid said quietly, her fingers tracing patterns on the serpent's scale. "But not the last. They know we come now. They know we seek what was taken." She looked up at Sigurd, her blind eyes somehow finding his in the darkness. "And they know we carry the means to bind them once again." The sound came at dawn, a deep, resonant toll that seemed to rise from the ocean floor itself. It shuddered through the wolf's wake's hull, setting the serpent's scale trembling in its rowan cradle. The bell's note held impossible harmonies, tones that spoke of depths where light had never reached, and secrets better left undisturbed. "There shouldn't be bells here," Thorvald One Hand muttered, his remaining hand white-knuckled on the rail. "We're leagues from any shore, any settlement." "Not all settlements lie above the waves," Astrid replied. She stood at the bow, her clouded eyes fixed on something the others couldn't see. "Listen, really listen." The bell tolled again, and this time they heard what lay beneath its surface, voices singing in a language that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. The lodestone in Ingvild's hands spun wildly before pointing directly downward. "They're calling to us," Hakon said, his usually steady voice trembling, like a church bell calling faithful to worship. Sigurd moved to the center of the ship, his hand on his sword hilt. "No church of any god I know rings bells in these waters." He turned to Astrid. "What calls us, Völva?" Before she could answer, the sea around them began to change. The water grew thick and dark, more like oil than water, and through its surface they could see lights, pale, cold lights that moved with purpose far below. "They show us the way," Astrid whispered. Her hands moved over the serpent's scale, which had begun to pulse in rhythm with the distant bell, down to where the old ones built their temples, where Eric and his crew. She stopped, her face paling. The bell tolled a third time, and with it came a vision that struck them all at once, a glimpse of massive stone structures rising from the seafloor, their architecture an affront to human perception. And moving among those alien spires, shapes that might once have been men. "There!" Ingvild cried, pointing to a disturbance in the water. Something was rising, something vast. They had prepared for this moment, had drilled until their movements were automatic. Warriors took up positions around the silver chain barrier, weapons ready. Astrid began to chant, her words making the scale shine with an inner light that pushed back the gathering darkness. But they weren't ready for what emerged. It rose like a mountain of flesh and scale, its body twisting in ways that denied natural law. Where its face should have been, there was only a mass of writhing appendages surrounding a bell, a massive bronze bell encrusted with coral and secrets. "Hold!" Sigurd's command cut through the terror that threatened to overwhelm his crew. "Hold the barrier, hold!" The creature struck, not with physical force but with sound. The bell at its center rang, and reality itself seemed to crack. Warriors fell to their knees, blood streaming from eyes and ears. The silver chains flared bright as stars, but began to dim under the assault. Through the chaos, Astrid's voice rose in the same alien tongue they'd heard in the bell's toll. The serpent's scale blazed in response, pushing back the darkness that threatened to engulf them. But it wasn't enough. A tendril of impossible darkness snaked through a gap in the weakening barrier. Thorvald, still struggling to rise from where the bell's toll had felled him, never saw it coming. "No!" Ingvild's cry came too late. The tendril wrapped around Thorvald's waist and yanked. The old sailor had time for one startled gasp before he was pulled through the barrier, through the ship's rail as if it was smoke, and into the waiting darkness below. The waters closed over him without a splash, without a ripple, as if he had never existed at all. In the terrible silence that followed, they heard it, a change in the bell's toll. Now it rang with Thorvald's voice, adding his song to the chorus that called from the deep. "He joins them," Astrid said, her voice hollow, as the others did, as Eric and his crew did. They take us and make us part of their song. The creature began to sink back into the depths, its bell still tolling, still calling. The lodestone pulled so strongly toward it that it nearly tore itself from Ingvild's grasp. "We follow," Sigurd declared, though his voice shook. "We follow, and we end this, for Thorvald, for my son, for all of them." As if in response, the bell tolled once more, a sound that carried both promise and warning. Below them, the twisted spires of an ancient temple waited in the darkness, where humans were never meant to tread, but where they must now go if they hoped to save their own. The storm came from nowhere, turning day to night in the space of 3 breaths. But these clouds weren't natural. They roiled with that same deep-sea phosphorescence they'd seen below, and the rain that fell stung like brine against exposed skin. Astrid knelt in the center of the ship, surrounded by what looked like river-smoothed stones, each the size of a child's fist. The speaking stones, she had called them, each one carved with sigils so ancient they predated the runes themselves. Now they clicked against each other with deliberate purpose, moved by more than just the pitching of the ship. "They answer the storm," she said, her voice barely audible above the supernatural gale. "Listen!" Between thunderclaps that shook the wolf's wake to her bones, voices rode the wind. Not the inhuman songs of the deep ones this time, but something far worse, familiar. Voices crying out in pain and desperation. "Father!" The word cut through the tempest like a blade, and Sigurd staggered as if struck. It was Eric's voice, clear as the day he'd sailed away. "Father, we see your fires, we hear your chain song, but the paths down here, they twist, they change. Time moves differently in the deep places." The speaking stones clattered more urgently now, their sigils glowing with the same sickly light as the storm clouds above. Astrid's hands moved over them, arranging and rearranging their patterns as she tried to maintain the connection. "Hold fast!" Ingvild called from the bow, where she fought to keep the lodestone steady. The magical compass pulled violently in. Multiple directions now, as if the voice's source kept shifting. "The stone tries to find them, but something interferes." Another voice rolled across the waves, this one belonging to Thorvald. But it wasn't the desperate cry of a drowning man. It was something calmer, almost peaceful, and somehow that was far more terrifying. The dark isn't so dark once your eyes change. The pressure isn't so heavy once your bones learn to bend. They show us such wonders down here. Lightning split the sky, but its color was wrong, a deep, oceanic blue that illuminated shapes. Within the storm clouds, massive serpentine forms coiled through the thunderheads as if swimming through water. The barrier of silver chains hummed and sparked in response to their presence. "The veil's thin," Astrid announced, her fingers dancing across the speaking stones. "The boundaries between above and below blur. What was sundered seeks to merge once more." As if to confirm her words, the rain began to fall upward, streaming. From the sea toward the storm clouds, in defiance of natural law, the warriors watched in horror as fish began to swim through the air around the ship, their scales gleaming with that same wrong light. Through it all, the voices continued, a chorus of the lost calling out from between the worlds. Each stone in Astrid's circle took on the voice of a different lost soul, creating a cacophony of testimony that painted a picture of the horror below. The temples rise forever down here. They feed us their knowledge, their memories. The old ones stir in their sleep. The harpoon bleeds in the shrine. Sigurd moved to the center of the ship, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Eric, where is the shrine? How do we reach you?" For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, the rain hanging suspended between sea and sky. Then Eric's voice came again, not from the wind this time, but from a single speaking stone that grew warm enough to steam in the cold air. "The bell marks the way, but beware. They let us speak, only to draw you down. They want the scale. They want what it represents. Don't trust what you see, Father. Don't trust what you hear, even our voices. We're not sure they're our own anymore." The stone cracked as the last word faded, its ancient sigils dulling to lifeless scratches. Around them, the storm began to dissipate as suddenly as it had. Formed, leaving behind a sea as smooth as glass and twice as dark. But something had changed. The lodestone's pull was stronger now, more certain, and in the distance, just at the edge of sight, a pale light pulsed in rhythm with the toll of that terrible bell. "He warned us," Håkon said quietly, "but we go anyway." "We go anyway," Sigurd confirmed, his eyes fixed on that distant light. "But now we know for certain. They live. Whatever else they've become, whatever changes the Deep Ones have worked upon them, my son and his crew still live." Astrid gathered the remaining speaking stones, her expression grave. "They live," she agreed. "But for how long? And when we find them, will we recognize what they've become?" The first sign was a streak of red in the black water. Not blood, but something that pulsed with its own inner light, like a wound in the fabric of the world itself. As they drew closer, they saw its source, a harpoon shaft protruding from the waves, standing straight up as if planted in invisible ground. Ancient runes crawled along its length, glowing with that same bloody radiance. "The binding weapon," Astrid breathed, the words forming frost in the suddenly cold air. "What Eirik took from the shrine." But it wasn't just the harpoon they saw. Wrapped around its shaft was a hand, human in shape, but wrong somehow, the fingers too long, the skin bearing the beginning of scales. As they watched, it released its grip and sank back into the depths. The serpent's scales screamed. There was no other word for it. A high, keening sound that set their teeth on edge and made the silver chains flutter like leaves in a storm. In response, something vast began to rise from the depths. "Weapons ready!" Sigurd's command cracked across the deck. "Form ranks!" They had barely taken positions when the first attack came, not from below this time, but from all around them. The water itself seemed to reach up, forming tentacles of liquid that ignored the laws of nature. Where they touched the silver chains, steam rose with a sound like dying screams. Through the chaos, Ingvild's voice rang out, "The lodestone burns! Something comes, something big." As if summoned by her words, it broke the surface, a serpentine form that dwarfed their ship, its scales the color of deep-sea trenches. But it was the eyes that struck terror into their hearts, hundreds of them, running along its length, each one holding the awareness of something ancient and utterly alien. "Child of Jörmungandr!" Astrid called out, her hands pressed against the serpent's scale. "We come to restore." The creature's response was not in words, but in pressure, a psychic wave that drove most of the crew to their knees. Images flooded their minds, the shrine as it had been, ages ago, when the first pact was made. They saw through ancient eyes as humans and serpent-kind met in the deep places, saw the forging of the harpoon in fires that burned underwater, saw the boundaries being drawn between the realms. Then came the breaking, Eirik and his crew finding the shrine, their torches illuminating what should have remained in darkness. The taking of the harpoon, not in malice but in ignorance, the surge of released power as ancient bonds shattered. "They didn't know," Sigurd gasped, his voice thick with horror and understanding. "My son didn't know what he was breaking." Another wave of images crashed through their minds, the price of the broken pact. The Deep Ones needed mortals now, needed their essence, their songs, their very souls to help maintain what remained of the boundaries. Without the harpoon's power, they drew strength from living sacrifices instead. Håkon was the first to see. The shapes moving beneath the serpent's coils, human figures swimming within human grace, their forms twisted by the Deep One's influence. Among them was Thorvald, his remaining hand now webbed, his eyes holding that same ancient awareness as the creature above. "The harpoon!" Astrid's voice cut through the mental onslaught. "We must reach it." But as Sigurd gave the order to move, the serpent child struck. Its tail swept across the water with impossible speed, smashing through the silver chain barrier as if it were spider's silk. Hakon, caught in the attack's path, managed one defiant cry before being crushed against the mast. His body fell to the deck, broken but not dead, and that, they realized with growing horror, was exactly what the creature intended. The cursed harpoon pulsed brighter, drawing power from the violence. Around its shaft, more hands emerged from the water, the lost crew reaching up as if in supplication or warning. "The barrier fails," Vígríðr shouted as the silver chains began to snap one by one. "We can't—" Her words cut off as something wrapped around her legs. Not a tentacle of water this time, but arms that were almost human. The last thing they saw was her face, not afraid but almost peaceful, as she was drawn over the side. Through it all, the serpent child watched with its 100 eyes, its massive form coiling around the wolf's wake in an ever-tightening spiral. And in their minds, its message became clear. The pact would be remade, one way or another. The only choice was whether they would give themselves willingly to the deep or be taken by force. In the aftermath of the serpent child's attack, the sea offered up its next terrible gift. They rose from the depths like bubbles of darkness, shells the size of drinking bowls, their surfaces swirling with colors that hurt the eye. Each one pulsed with memories not meant for mortal minds. "Memory shells," Astrid whispered, her hands trembling as she lifted one from the water. "The deep ones use them to hold the essence of what they take, to preserve the songs of those they change." The remaining crew gathered around her, their faces illuminated by the shell's ethereal glow. The serpent's scale hummed in harmony with it, creating a resonance that made the air itself seem to thicken. "Show us," Sigurd commanded, his voice hoarse with grief and determination. "Show us what happened to my son." Astrid pressed her palms against the shell's surface, and the world dissolved around them. They were no longer on the wolf's wake, but aboard the Vígríðr, seeing through Eric's eyes as he first discovered the underwater shrine. The memory had a strange quality to it, simultaneously sharp as a blade and fluid as a dream. The shrine's spires rose before them, impossible structures that ignored all human concepts of architecture. Schools of luminescent fish swam through archways that seemed to lead into other worlds. And there, at the center of it all, stood the harpoon, its runes pulsing with an inner light that called to something deep in their souls. "We didn't know," Eric's voice echoed through their minds, clear now of the distortion that had plagued it during the storm. "We thought we'd found some lost treasure, some relic of the old times, but when I pulled the harpoon free—" The memory shifted, showing the moment of breaking. They felt Eric's triumph turn to terror as the water around them began to change, becoming thick with ancient awareness. The shrine's walls rippled like living flesh, and from every shadow emerged the children of Jörmungandr, their forms too vast and strange for human minds to fully comprehend. Through Eirik's eyes, they watched the crew's transformation begin. It started slowly, a shimmer in the skin, a strange new awareness of the pressure around them, the ability to breathe water as easily as air. But with each passing moment, each new change, they felt less human, more something else. "They needed us." Another voice joined the memory, Vígríðr's, fresh from her recent taking. "Need us still. The boundaries between worlds require anchors." And with the harpoon's power broken, the shell in Astrid's hands grew warmer, and another memory surfaced. They saw through multiple sets of eyes now, the entire crew's perspective as they were led deeper into the shrine, down to places where even the deep ones rarely ventured. There, in a chamber that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, they learned the truth. The first pact, Astrid narrated, her voice distant, was more than just a boundary between realms. It was a prison, binding something older than the serpent children themselves, something that slumbers in the deepest trenches, dreaming dreams that would drive the gods themselves to madness. The memory pulsed with terror and wonder as they witnessed what lay in that ancient chamber. The images were mercifully blurred, their minds unable or unwilling to fully process what they saw, but the understanding came through clearly enough. Without The harpoon's power, without the pact it represented, that thing in the depths would eventually wake. The deep ones are not evil, Eric's voice continued, heavy with the weight of transformed understanding. They're guardians in their own way. When we broke the pact, they did what they had to do. They preserve us, use our life force, our songs, to help maintain the barriers. But it's not enough. The boundaries weaken with each passing tide. The memory began to fade, but not before showing them one final truth. In the shrine's depths, they saw the harpoon's resting place, an altar of living stone that pulsed in rhythm with the world's heartbeat. And they understood what had to be done. The pact must be remade, Astrid said, as the memory shells glow. Dimmed, but not as it was before. The deep ones didn't take the crew's humanity. They merged with it, created something new. And that's what the new pact requires. A willing union of above and below. Sigurd stared at the shell in her hands, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. My son, he's not lost then, just changed. Changed, Astrid agreed. As we all must change if we're to prevent what comes. The question is, are we willing to pay that price? Around them, more memory shells rose to the surface, each containing another piece of the truth, another fragment of the transformation that awaited them. And beneath it all, growing stronger with each moment, they felt the hunger of the thing that slumbered in the deep, waiting for the barriers to fail completely. From the depths of her robes, Astrid withdrew an object that seemed to absorb the surrounding light, a disk of black metal, its surface etched with spiraling channels that slowly filled with a liquid too red to be natural blood. The blood compass had been a last resort, a tool she'd hoped never to use. Its magic required life to power it, and it took more than just a few drops. The old ways demand balance, she said, holding the compass flat in her palm. To find a soul in the deep, another must offer part of their own. The remaining crew watched as she drew a bone knife across her free hand, letting her blood mix with whatever already filled the compass's channels. The liquid began to move with purpose, flowing through the spiral patterns until it formed arrows pointing in multiple directions. There, she breathed, her face pale from more than just blood loss. I can feel them. Vígríðr is closest, her transformation still new enough that she remembers being human. Sigurd studied the compass's shifting patterns. Can we still reach her? Bring her back? Not back, Astrid corrected, but perhaps through. The deep one's change can be guided by those willing to share the journey, but it requires more blood. One of the remaining warriors, Greta's shield sister, stepped forward. Take mine. Vígríðr and I shared our first raid, our first kill. If anyone can reach her, I can. Before anyone could stop her, Greta drew her knife across her palm, letting her blood fall onto the compass's surface. The effect was immediate and terrible. She fell to her knees, gasping as the compass flared with an inner light that cast no shadows. In its depths they could see Vígríðr, not as she had been, but as she was becoming. Hold the chain circle, Astrid commanded as the water around the ship began to churn. The warriors, still capable of fighting, raised the silver chains once more, creating a barrier that hummed with protective energy. Through the swirling waters, they saw her approach. Vígríðr's form was a hybrid now, still recognizably human from the waist up, but changed, adapted to the deep. Her eyes held the same ancient awareness they'd seen in the serpent child's gaze, but behind it, something of her original self remained. Greta, Vígríðr's voice carried through the water as clearly as if she spoke in air. I feel you. I feel your offering. Come back to us, Greta gasped, still on her knees as the compass drew more of her essence. Fight it. Back. Vígríðr rose further from the waves, and they saw how far the transformation had progressed. Patterns like those on the serpent scale had begun to form on her skin, and her movements held an inhuman grace. There is no back, shield sister, only forward, only through. The blood compass pulsed brighter, and Greta screamed, not in pain, but in sudden understanding as Vígríðr's memories flooded her mind. She saw the truth of the Deep One's purpose. felt the weight of their ancient burden, and knew what had to be done. "Together, then," Greta said, her voice changing as she spoke, taking on harmonics that echoed in their bones. She reached out through the barrier of silver chains, and where her hand passed, the water itself seemed to reach back. "No!" Sigurd moved to stop her, but Astrid held him back. "This is the price," the Völva said. "This is how we save them, not by bringing them back, but by joining them with full knowledge and willing hearts. The deep ones cannot take what is freely given." They watched in mingled horror and wonder as Greta stepped through the barrier. The moment she entered the water, the transformation began. But unlike those taken unwillingly, she remained conscious, remained herself, even as the deep one's power reshaped her. Ingvild embraced her, and where they touched, the changes flowed faster. The blood compass grew dim as its purpose was fulfilled, but not before showing them the truth. Two souls merged into something new, something that could exist in both. Worlds that could help maintain the boundaries that kept ancient horrors at bay. "One soul recovered," Astrid said softly, "bound now to a willing partner. But we have more to save, and the compass demands fresh blood for each journey." As our remaining warriors looked at each other, understanding dawning in their eyes. This was how it would have to be. Pairs of souls, joined by choice and sacrifice, becoming something more than human, but not quite of the deep. A new kind of pact, written in blood and transformation. In the distance, the cursed harpoon pulsed brighter, as if acknowledging this new path. And deeper still, in the lightless trenches where nightmares dwelled, something stirred in its sleep, sensing the first threads of a new binding being woven. The whalebone flute emerged from the waves, like a ghost ascending, its surface dark with age and secrets. Longer than a man's arm and inscribed with spiraling patterns that matched those on the shrine far below, it floated to the ship's side as if guided by unseen hands. "An artifact from the First Age," Astrid said, reaching for it with trembling fingers. When the boundaries between worlds were still being drawn and music held power that runes could only dream of capturing. The moment her fingers touched the flute, the air changed. Sound became color, and color became memory. The remaining crew found themselves falling into a vision of the world as it had been, before the gods themselves had fully formed their realms. The seas were different then, deeper, darker, filled with awareness that predated life itself. From those depths rose the first children of Jomungandr, not yet bound by any pact, free to swim the waters between worlds. And with them came the things they fled from, horrors so ancient they had no names, only hunger. The flute's first note keened across the water, carrying the weight of eons. In response, the serpent's scale began to pulse, and the memory shells they'd gathered hummed in harmony. They saw the first voleur, standing on shores now long sunk beneath the waves. Armed with instruments carved from the bones of great sea creatures, they called to the serpent children, offering a bargain. Together, they could bind the ancient ones, create boundaries between the realms that would keep the worst horrors at bay. Another note and the vision shifted. The water around the wolf's wake became transparent, revealing the shrine below in all its original glory. But now they understood its true purpose. Not a temple, but a lock. Not a holy place, but a prison. The price was always transformation, Astrid played on, her fingers finding patterns in the flute's holes that had not been touched by human hands in millennia. The deep ones needed anchors in our world, needed human souls to help maintain the boundaries, and humans needed guardians against what lurked in the lightless places. The music painted images in their minds, the forging of the first harpoons, blessed with power from both realms. The creation of the shrines built on points where the barriers between worlds were thinnest. The first willing sacrifices, humans, who chose to become something more, something other, to protect both their people and the serpent children from what waited in the deep. They watched as the great binding was woven, thousands of transformed souls, their songs joining with the serpent children's power, creating a net of energy that trapped the ancient horrors in their trenches. The harpoons served as physical Anchors, their runes maintaining the pattern of the prison. "So much lost to time," Sigurd whispered, his voice thick with understanding. "We forgot the true purpose, forgot that the Deep Ones were allies, not enemies." The flute's song turned mournful, showing them centuries of slow forgetting. Humans began to fear the Deep Ones, to see them as monsters rather than guardians. The meaning of the shrines was lost, the harpoons becoming mere weapons in stories, told around fires, until Eric and his crew found the shrine and in their ignorance broke the pact that had kept the world safe for ages. But the vision didn't end there. The flute's final notes showed them something else, a possibility, a path forward. They saw what Greta and Ingvild had become, their transformed selves swimming the boundaries between worlds. But now they saw the greater purpose of such unions. "Each willing transformation strengthens the barriers," Astrid explained, lowering the flute. "Each freely given sacrifice adds a new thread to the binding. But it must be done properly, with full knowledge and acceptance. Only then can the magic work as it was meant to." The vision faded, leaving them once more on the dark surface of the sea. But the knowledge remained, burning in their minds like a fever dream. The whalebone flute had shown them not just the past, but the pattern for the future. "The Deep Ones remember," came Ingvild's voice from the water, her transformed form barely visible beneath the surface. "They remember when we worked together, when the boundaries were maintained by choice and understanding, not force and fear." Greta's voice joined hers, the two harmonizing in ways that human throats were never meant to achieve. "The old ways can be restored, but time grows short. The ancient ones stir in their prison, sensing the weakening of their bonds." The flute pulsed one final time, offering a glimpse of what awaited if they failed. A world where the boundaries collapsed completely, where things older than gods rose from the trenches to reclaim what had once been theirs. In the distance, the cursed harpoon's glow pulsed brighter, calling them toward the choice they now knew they had to make. It rose from the depths like a shard of midnight, a mirror forged from black glass, its surface rippling like disturbed water even in solid form. No reflection showed in its depths, only an absence so complete it seemed to swallow the torchlight. "The dark mirror," Astrid breathed, her voice tight with dread. "The Deep Ones use it to see their true forms. But it shows other truths as well, things no mortal was meant to witness." The mirror floated before them, rotating slowly in the air, as if suspended by invisible strings. The serpent scale reacted violently to its presence, vibrating so hard it nearly shook free of its rowan cradle. "Look!" one of the remaining warriors cried, pointing to the mirror's surface. Within its depths, something moved, something vast and ancient and utterly wrong. They tried to turn away, but the mirror's pull was irresistible. Its surface rippled and cleared, showing them what waited in the lightless trenches below. The human mind was never meant to comprehend such geometries, such impossible forms. Several warriors fell to their knees, blood trickling from their eyes. "It sees us," Astrid whispered, her clouded eyes wide with terror. "Through the mirror, it sees us, and we see it, and both are equally dangerous." The thing in the depths had no name, no form that could be described in any human tongue. It was older than the serpent children, older than the gods themselves, a hunger that had existed since the first drops of water gathered in the first ocean. And now, with the barriers weakening, it was finally stirring from its ancient sleep. Through the mirror, they watched as it reached upward with appendages that ignored physical law. The water around the ship grew thick and strange, taking on properties of solid matter while remaining liquid. The silver chain barrier flared bright as stars, but began to corrode where the transformed water touched it. "Hold fast!" Sigurd commanded, but his voice held an edge of desperation. "The barrier's still—" His words cut off as shapes erupted from the water. Not the serpent children this time, but things that might once have been fish, might once have been whales, twisted by proximity to the ancient horror into forms that defied sanity. They threw themselves against the barrier, their flesh dissolving and reforming with each impact. The dark mirror pulsed with each attack, and in its depths they saw the truth of what they faced. The horror below was not simply trying to break free. It was trying to remake reality itself, to return the world to what it had been before the boundaries existed, before life as they knew it had evolved. 3 warriors fell in the first wave, their minds simply stopping as they saw too much, understood too much through the mirror's merciless lens. 2 more were taken by the twisted sea things, dragged below by forms that shifted between states of matter, like fever dreams. "The mirror shows the way," Astrid shouted above the chaos. "Look, behind the horror, the shrine." Through the mirror's surface they could see it now, the ancient structure where the cursed harpoon waited. But reaching it meant going through the chaos, through the zone where reality itself broke down in the Ancient One's presence. A tendril of impossible geometry reached through the barrier, wrapping around one of the remaining warriors. But before it could drag him below, something else intercepted it. Ingvild and Greta, their transformed forms moving with fluid grace through the corrupted water. Their voices joined in harmony, producing sounds that made the tendril recoil. "The changed ones," Astrid's voice carried revelation. "They can exist in both states. They can move through its influence without being unmade." The dark mirror's surface rippled again, showing them more transformed crew members swimming through the chaos, including Eric, his new form both beautiful and terrible. They were fighting the horror, their hybrid nature allowing them to resist its reality-warping influence. But it wasn't enough. The Ancient One's power was growing with each passing moment, its influence reaching up through the waters like poisoned roots. Through the mirror, they watched as parts of the ocean simply ceased to exist, replaced by geometries that hurt to look upon. "We have to reach the shrine," Sigurd said, his voice steady despite the madness surrounding them. "We have to restore the binding before that thing breaks free completely." The dark mirror pulsed one final time, showing them the price of victory, the transformation that awaited any who dared pass through the horror's influence to reach the shrine. There could be no return to purely human form after passing through such chaos. "Then we pay it," came a voice, and Sigurd turned to see his remaining warriors step forward, their faces set with grim determination. They had seen the truth in the mirror, seen what awaited if they failed. The horror reached for them again, its touch promising dissolution or worse. But now they had a path, though it led through madness, through transformation, through a change from which there could be no return. The binding runes appeared on the water's surface like frost forming on dark glass, ancient symbols more complex than any mortal script, each one containing universes of meaning. They formed circles within circles, patterns that spoke of endings and beginnings, of boundaries and the prices paid to maintain them. "The deep ones show us the way," Astrid said, her hands moving over the serpent scale, which had begun to resonate with the rune's power. "These are the original bindings, the patterns that first locked the horror away. But to remake them, we need anchors," Sigurd finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Living anchors, like before." Around them, reality continued to fragment. The ancient horror's influence reached higher, turning water to geometries that shouldn't exist, twisting the very air into shapes that made thought difficult. Through it all, the binding runes glowed with steady purpose, offering a path through the chaos. "The runes must be activated in sequence," Astrid explained, her voice taking on harmonics that didn't sound entirely human. "Each one requires a transformation, a willing sacrifice to power it, but they must be done properly in pairs or the binding will fail." The remaining warriors, now only 6 strong, looked at each other with grim understanding. They had seen through the dark. Mirror what awaited them. They knew the price. "I'll take the first rune," said Harold Frostborn, stepping forward. His sister Helga moved with him, their hands clasped. "We entered this world together," she said. "We'll enter the next the same way." The siblings stepped into the circle of the first binding rune. The moment their feet touched the glowing symbol, the transformation began. But unlike those taken unwillingly, they remained conscious, their voices rising in harmony as the Deep One's power reshaped them. Their skin took on the texture of deep-sea creatures, their eyes growing large and strange. Gills opened along their necks, and their fingers lengthened, webbing forming between them. But their faces, though changed, retained something essentially human, something that spoke of choice rather than force. The first rune flared bright as starfire as the transformation completed, its power anchored by their willing sacrifice. The siblings slipped into the waves, their new forms moving with fluid grace through the chaos-touched water. "The second rune!" Astrid called, her voice urgent. "Quickly!" But before the next pair could step forward, the horror struck back. A tendril of impossible geometry lashed through their diminished barrier, wrapping around the serpent's scale. The artifact screamed, a sound that contained all the agony of transformation, compressed into a single note. "No!" Astrid tried to hold onto the scale, but its rowan cradle was splintering under the horror's assault. "Without this, we can't—" That's when they heard it. A song rising from the depths, carried on currents that still obeyed the old laws. Eric's voice, joined by the rest of his transformed crew, calling to the scale in languages older than humanity. The artifact's scream changed, becoming something else, something that spoke of choice and change rather than violation. "Let it go," Sigurd said softly, placing his hand on Astrid's shoulder. "It returns to its own kind." The scale slipped from its broken cradle, but instead of being drawn into the horror's grasp, it flew to Eric's waiting hands. The moment he touched it, his transformation accelerated, completing itself according to the ancient patterns. The scale became part of him, its power merging with his changed flesh. Two more warriors stepped into the second rune, Gunnar Waverunner and his shield companion Svanna. Their transformation was faster, guided by the knowledge gained from those who had gone before. As they slipped beneath the waves, the second rune flared to life, its power joining with the first. But the horror wasn't finished. Another attack lashed upward, this one striking Astrid herself. The Völva screamed as chaos-touched water wrapped around her legs, trying to unmake her very existence. "The third rune," she gasped, fighting against the horror's grip. "It must be completed. The pattern must—" The last pair of warriors moved to help her, but she waved them back. "No, take the rune. Complete the circle. She looked at Sigurd, something ancient and terrible moving behind her clouded eyes. "I'll hold it back. Long enough. But you—" Sigurd met her gaze, understanding what she wasn't saying. Someone would need to take the final rune. Someone would need to complete the pattern. And now, with Astrid making her last stand, that left only him. The horror pulled harder, drawing Astrid toward the chaos-touched water. But as she went under, her voice rose in the same harmonies they'd heard from the transformed ones. Not a scream of terror, but a song of defiance. She had chosen this end, chosen to buy them the time they needed with her willing sacrifice. The third rune pulsed, waiting for its anchors, while beneath the waves, the horror's power grew stronger with each passing moment. From the chaos-touched waters emerged something that seemed to bend light around itself. A fang larger than a man's arm, ancient beyond reckoning. Its surface held the same otherworldly sheen as the serpent's scale, but where the scale had been defensive, the fang radiated purpose. This was a weapon, meant to pierce the veils between worlds. "Father!" Eric's voice carried across the waves, his transformed shape rising from the depths with the world serpent's fang held before him. The Deep Ones kept this hidden, waiting for the moment when all paths would converge, when someone would choose to wield it willingly. Sigurd stood alone on the deck of the Wolf's Wake, watching as his transformed son approached. Eric's new form was magnificent and terrible. The serpent's scale had merged with his flesh, creating patterns that flowed like living water across his skin. His eyes held depths that spoke of ancient knowledge, but behind that otherworldly awareness, something fundamentally human remained. "The fang can pierce the horror's essence," Eric explained, his voice carrying harmonics that made the remaining binding runes pulse with recognition. but only if wielded by one who straddles both worlds, one who chooses the transformation with full knowledge of its price. Around them, the battle intensified. The transformed crew members, those who had taken the first 3 binding runes, fought against the horror's manifestations. Harold and Helga moved in perfect synchronization, their voices joining in songs that turned chaos-touched water back into natural sea. Gunnar and Svanna wove patterns of power through the waves, creating safe passages through the reality-warping chaos. But it wasn't enough. The horror's influence continued to spread, its impossible geometries reaching ever higher. Where Astrid had disappeared beneath the waves, a whirlpool of fractured reality formed, spinning off fragments of space-time that shouldn't exist in any sane universe. The final rune must be powered, Eric said, drawing closer. But more than that, the horror itself must be struck, must be forced back into its prison. The Fang can do this, but it needs a wielder, Sigurd finished. He looked at the weapon his transformed son offered, a piece of Jörmungandr itself, broken off in some ancient battle and imbued with power by the Deep Ones. Someone who chooses to change. The horror struck again, its attack more focused. Now, as if it sensed the threat, reality buckled around the wolf's wake, the wooden planks under Sigurd's feet beginning to transform into substances that had no name in any human tongue. Through the chaos, he saw them all, his transformed warriors, fighting with desperate courage, their new forms allowing them to exist in these broken spaces between states of being. He saw Ingvild and Greta, their merged consciousness, directing attacks that would have been impossible for either alone. He saw his son holding out hope and doom in the form of an ancient weapon, and he saw what waited below. The dark mirror's vision had prepared him somewhat, but seeing the horror with transformed eyes would be different. To strike at its heart, he would have to draw close to it, would have to face the full weight of its ancient, awful awareness. "The Deep Ones will guide you," Eric said softly, understanding his father's thoughts. "As they guided us. The change. It's not an ending, Father. It's an evolution. A transformation into something that can fight this battle across centuries." Another attack shattered what remained of the silver chain barrier. The horror's power reached for Sigurd with tendrils of unlight, seeking to unmake him as it had, and made so many others. But before it could touch him, a song rose from the depths. Astrid's voice, changed but unbowed, joined now with the harmonies of the Deep Ones themselves. "Choose!" she called, her new form rising briefly from the chaos-touched waters. Her transformation had been violent, uncontrolled, but she had survived it, had turned it to purpose. "Choose now, Jarl of Ravenfjord! Choose for all our worlds!" The final binding rune pulsed beneath his feet, waiting for its anchor. The world serpent's fang gleamed with ancient purpose in his son's transformed hands. And below, the horror's vast bulk shifted, sensing the moment of decision upon them. Sigurd looked one last time at the sky above, at the world of air and sunlight he had known all his life. Then he reached out and grasped the fang. The transformation began immediately, power flowing up his arm like living lightning. But unlike those taken unwillingly, he directed it, shaped it with his understanding and purpose. The fang's power merged with his changing flesh, becoming part of him as the scale had become part of his son. Together, father and son began to sink beneath the waves, moving toward the horror's heart. The final battle would be fought in the deep places, where light had never reached, where reality itself grew thin, and the song of their transformation rose to join the others, adding new harmonies to an ancient chorus. At the heart of the chaos, where water became something else entirely, floated an artifact that defied comprehension, a sphere that seemed to contain moving oceans within its crystalline surface. The Tide Turner, last and greatest of the Deep One's treasures, held the power to reshape the very boundaries between worlds. Sigurd, his transformation nearly complete, felt its pull as he and Eirik descended through layers of fractured reality. His new senses perceived the Tide Turner as more than just an object. It was a nexus, a point where all possible states of existence converged. The horror seeks it. Eric's voice resonated through the chaos-touched water. With it, it could not only break free, but reshape all realities to match the chaos of its own existence. Sigurd's changed form moved with growing confidence through the impossible geometries. The world serpent's fang, now fused with his transforming flesh, pulsed with ancient purpose. Around them, the horror's vast bulk shifted and writhed, its countless eyes focusing on their approach. Pretenders, its thoughts crashed through their minds, alien concepts forcing themselves into human understanding. You swim through waters that existed before your kind learned to crawl. Your barriers are nothing. Your bindings are less than nothing. The transformed crew gathered around them, their voices joining in harmonies that helped hold reality together. Harald and Helga wove patterns of order through chaos. Gunnar and Svana's merged consciousness projected shields of pure thought. And through it all, Astrid's changed form darted between dimensions, her vulva's knowledge expanded by her transformation. "The tide turner shows us truth," she called, her voice carrying through mediums that weren't quite water anymore. "The horror doesn't seek escape, it seeks to return all existence to its original state, before order, before life, before thought itself." The horror's attack came from everywhere at once. Tentacles of pure chaos that ignored physical law, reaching for them through spaces that shouldn't exist. But the transformed crew was ready. Their songs rose in complex harmonies, creating patches of stable reality through which Sigurd and Eirik could advance. "Your songs are echoes," the horror's thoughts boomed. "Your changes are temporary. All returns to chaos. All returns to me." The tide turner pulsed brighter as they approached, its inner oceans moving with increasing speed. Sigurd could see the currents of reality flowing through it, past, present and future all swirling together, and he understood what had to be done. "The Fang!" he called to Eirik, his voice carrying new harmonics as his transformation neared completion. "It's not meant to wound the horror itself." "No," Eirik agreed, the serpent scale patterns on his flesh glowing with power. "It's meant to pierce the point where all realities meet, to create a new kind of binding." They were close. Enough now to see the horror's true form, a mass of shifting possibilities, a thing that existed in all states simultaneously. Its vast bulk wrapped around the tide turner like a possessive lover, trying to force its chaos through the artifact's crystalline surface. The transformed crew's song reached a crescendo, each pair adding their unique harmonies to create a moment of clarity in the chaos. Through that brief window of stability, Sigurd saw the point where everything converged, the single moment where past, present and future became one. With his son at his side, he struck. The world's serpent's fang pierced reality itself, driving through the point of convergence. The horror's scream existed in all frequencies at once, from the deepest ocean trenches to the spaces between stars. Reality buckled, tried to tear itself apart, but the transformed crew held firm. Their songs took on new power as the final binding rune activated, powered by Sigurd's willing transformation. The tide turner's surface rippled, and through it, they all saw what was happening, not just here and now, but across all possible realities. The horror was not being destroyed. It could not be destroyed, but it could be bound in a new way, sealed not in a prison of space, but in a prison of a possibility. The Fang held it pinned at the convergence point, while the tide turner's power began to reshape reality around it. "You cannot hold me," the horror's thoughts raged. "I am eternal. I am changed," Sigurd finished, his transformation completing in that moment of ultimate convergence. "As we are changed, as all things must change." The tide turner's power reached its peak. Reality shifted, reformed, found new patterns that could exist between order and chaos. The horror's influence began to recede, bound now not by artificial barriers, but by the very nature of existence itself. Through it all, the transformed crew sang their songs of binding, no longer fighting chaos, but incorporating it, channeling it, giving it form and purpose. They had become something new, not quite human, not quite of the deep, but guardians of the boundaries between all states of being. The final battle was ending, but its consequences would ripple through all possible worlds, for all possible futures. The age of rigid boundaries was over. The age of transformation had begun. In the aftermath of the binding, a new artifact formed from the convergence of energies, a stone that seemed to hold galaxies in its depths, its surface shifting. With memories both human and other, the memory stone crystallized between Sigurd's transformed hands, collecting the experiences of all who had witnessed the remaking of reality. Through its faceted surface, they saw themselves as they now were, no longer merely human, but not quite of the deep either. Their forms shifted with thought and purpose, able to exist in multiple states of being. The patterns that had begun with the serpent's scale had spread to them all, marking them as guardians of the boundaries between order and chaos. "We must remember," Astrid's transformed voice sang through waters that were slowly returning to normal. "Remember what we were, what we have become, and why the change was necessary." Her vulvar's sight, enhanced by her new nature, perceived layers of reality that her human eyes had never dreamed of seeing. The memory stone pulsed with each new recollection added to its depths. They saw the battle from all perspectives at once, the horror's attack, the crew's transformation, the final binding that had changed not just their world, but all possible worlds. More than that, they saw what they had become. Beings capable of swimming through realities as easily as fish swam through water. Eirik moved closer to his father, his form rippling with patterns that matched Sigurd's own. "The deep ones welcome us," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of ancient knowledge, not as servants or sacrifices, but as equals, as guardians of the spaces between. Around them, the transformed crew moved with growing confidence through their new existence. Harald and Helga wove between states of being, their sibling bond enhanced by their transformation. Gunnar and Svanna's merged consciousness explored dimensions that had no names in human tongues. Even those who had been taken unwillingly, like Ingvild, had found purpose in their new existence. The memory stone showed them more, the patterns of reality forming around the horror's new prison. It was contained now, not by force, but by the very nature of existence itself. The world serpent's fang had pinned it at the point of convergence, while the tide-turner's power had reshaped reality to accommodate both order and chaos in balanced measure. "We are the living boundaries now," Astrid sang, her form shifting between states as she spoke, no longer needing silver chains or iron runes to hold back the darkness. We carry the barriers within ourselves, maintaining the balance through what we have become. The stone surface rippled, showing them the paths ahead. They saw themselves swimming the currents between worlds, guiding lost souls, maintaining the boundaries that kept reality stable. They saw future transformations, other humans who would choose to join them, understanding now that change could be a beginning rather than an end. Sigurd, still adjusting to his new awareness, reached out to touch the stone. "What of Ravnfjord?" he asked, his thoughts turning to the human world they were leaving behind. "What of our people?" The stone's response came in images. The fjords. Waters would remain protected, guarded by those who could swim between states of being. The Deep One's children would no longer be enemies, but allies, working with the transformed crew to maintain the new boundaries. And sometimes, when the need was great or the calling strong enough, others would choose to join them. "We bridge the gaps," Eirik said, understanding flowing through their enhanced connection. "Between human and Deep One, between order and chaos, between all states of being. That is our purpose now, to maintain not separation but balance." The memory stone pulsed one final time, showing them the pattern of their new existence. They would guard the boundaries of reality itself, swimming through dimensions that human minds could barely comprehend. the horror would remain bound, but not in darkness and denial, rather in a state of balanced existence, its chaos contained and given purpose. "It's time," Astrid sang, her form stabilizing into something that combined the best of both worlds, human wisdom and deep one power. "Time to learn our new waters, to understand our new purpose." The transformed crew gathered around her, their forms shifting in harmony with the currents of reality. The memory stone floated between them, recording this moment of transition. For all who might follow their path, they were leaving the world of pure humanity behind, but they were not leaving it unprotected. As they prepared to depart, to swim the spaces between spaces, Sigurd looked back one last time at the surface far above. The waters were calm now, showing no sign of the reality-changing battle that had taken place in their depths. But he knew that nothing would ever be quite the same, not the sea, not the world, and certainly not themselves. The age of rigid boundaries was truly over. The age of transformation had begun, and they would be its first guardians. In Ravnfjord's harbour, where the story began, a new artifact now stands sentinel, a crystal that both floats and sinks, that exists in multiple states at once. The peace. Crystal pulses with soft light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, its surface reflecting both the world above and the mysteries below. The fisherfolk say that on certain nights, when the tide runs strange and the stars align just so, they see shapes moving through the crystal's light. Forms that might once have been human, swimming through realities that mortal eyes can barely perceive. They speak of Sigurd and his transformed crew, of Eric and his father, now guardians of the boundaries between all possible worlds. Sometimes, they say, the crystal sings, songs that carry hints of human voices merged with deeper, older harmonies. The songs speak of balance rather than division, of transformation rather than loss. They tell of horrors bound not by force, but by understanding, of chaos given form and purpose, of boundaries maintained by those who choose to exist in all states at once. And in the depths below Ravnfjord, where the water grows thick with possibilities, the transformed crew swims their eternal patrol. They are not lost, as some feared, but transformed into something greater, beings who maintain the balance between order and chaos, between surface and deep, between all the infinite states of existence. The peace crystal stands as testament to their choice, their sacrifice, their evolution. It reminds those who see it that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying what we fear, but from becoming something new enough, something strange enough to understand it. And in its depths, for those who know how to look, the crystal shows endless possibilities still waiting to be born.